I'm Holly Replogle-Wong from the UCLA Center for Musical Humanities, and it is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the conference, who's come a long way to be with us today, Ruthie Abelovich. Ruthie is an assistant professor of theater and performance studies at Tel Aviv University. She teaches and researches in the fields of Jewish theater and performance, popular culture, theater history, sound, voice, and media. In 2021, she received a European Research Council starting grant to pursue research on the themes, forms, and practices of the popular Yiddish theater at the turn of the century and established the Dybbuk Research Project, an interdisciplinary collaborative project of scholars and artists researching various facets of Yiddish performative culture between 1880 and 1920. She is the author of Possessed Voices, Oral Remains from Modernist Hebrew Theater, finalist for the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award, co-editor of A Stage of Their Own, 7 American Feminist Plays, and co-editor of Borderlines, Essays and Maps on the Logic of Place. She has contributed to the Oxford Handbook from Jewish Music Studies and to the edited volume, The Dybbuk Century, and has published articles in the journals TDR, Theater Journal, Performance Research, Theater Research International, European Journal of Jewish Studies, Ingeveb, Classical Sociology, and New Media and Society. Ruthie's talk today is entitled From Synagogue to Stage, How Yiddish Theater Transformed Cultural Memory, delving deep into the themes of our conference for today. Please join me in welcoming Ruthie. Thank you.
So, thank you, Holly. So I'm deeply appreciative for the opportunity to share my work here with you, all of you today. The past month have been filled with challenges, making it even more special for me to be here, and even more crucial, perhaps, to have the chance to delve into the world of Yiddish theater. So first, I'd like to thank Professor Mark Kligman for his unwavering friendship and support, which have meant a great deal for me. And of course, extend my thanks to Daniela Smolov-Levy and Holly Replogle-Wong for their efforts in organizing this conference. So over the next 45 minutes or so, I invite you to join me in a journey of exploration into the intricate relationship between the Yiddish theater and the synagogue and examine how this connection has impacted Jewish cultural memory. So in his 1899 essay on the music of his operas and operettas, Avram Goldfaden describes the oral relationships between the synagogue and the theater. During the same evening, Goldfaden writes, the same musical repertoire could have and probably were intoned both in the synagogue and on the theater stage, albeit with variations. Goldfaden unfolds the different bodily responses to the music in the theater and in the synagogue. At the synagogue, the cantorial melodies were sung, whereas in the theater they were danced to. The theater and the synagogue both feature in this description as corresponding spheres for eliciting and mobilizing the sought-for embodied response to the music, joint singing or dancing. So by doing so, Goldfaden considers the shared musical repertoires as binding together the religious experience of the synagogue with the frivolous performances of the emerging modern Yiddish theater. During its formative years and into the first decades of the 20th century, Yiddish theater heavily relied on the synagogal musical repertoire as well as on the congregational experience of its audiences, while shaping and altering their core forms. Geared by commercial drives, Yiddish theater practitioners like Goldfaden and his peers attracted Jewish audiences to novel popular theatrical forms like the opera and the operetta by interlacing into their performances audiovisual references that served their audiences as identity beacons for self-orientation. Songs and stories from Jewish religious tradition enabled him to expose Jewish audiences to the recreational world of the new modern culture. And thus, the early Yiddish popular theater presents us with an instance in which different forms of performative knowledge and media converged. The Yiddish theater incorporated performance elements of the synagogue rituals while disrupting their traditional expressions with new setups. Theatergoers attending popular Yiddish performances listened to this mixture of very different performance legacies, discerning the different nuances and connotations, and recognizing the alterations made to liturgies and folk songs played in the theater. Listening to this hybrid aesthetics became a method of understanding, an epistemic tool for audiences to comprehend and negotiate their dynamic realms. The convergence of the synagogue and the theater also looms in subsequent discussions about American immigrant culture, in which the Yiddish theater is described as both competitor and successor of the synagogue. Ronald Sanders, for example, writes in his 1980 book On the Lower East Side that the appeal of the Yiddish theater greatly surpassed that of traditional religious institutions, and argues that in America, the Yiddish theater and the Yiddish press provided the institutions with a new kind of religiosity. If the press was the world's Talmud, the theater was its synagogue, in Sanders' words. According to this description, the Yiddish theater has overtaken the synagogue as an arena of Jewish learning, replacing theology and philology with embodied knowledge that acted and reenacted dramatic plots, songs, and liturgies that resonated with Jewish tradition and mythical memory, reshaping them anew according to modern aesthetic forms. A caricature from Der Kibbutzer sparks yet another perspective through which we can think of the entangled relationship between these two arenas. This 1911 illustration, titled God in Theaterschule, presents a hyphenated connection between the theater and the synagogue. The theme and structure of this drawing show two rectangular frames connected by a short text. In the frame to the left, God, a bearded man wearing a mantle, visits the theater. His gaze is fixed on the stage. In the background, we can see the audience, both men and women, wearing their best attires, filling up the main seating area and the upper balconies of the hall. To the right, the same theater. This time, the audience comprises of praying men, most of them wearing a talit, but some are dressed in their daily suits. Most of them are immersed in prayer, but some are also depicted caught sleeping. Near the stage, a bearded man standing with his back to the audience, leaning over a book placed on a small bine. Two women are peeping into the hall from the left stage wings. Their faces emerge from in between the curtains. Between these two scenes, we spot a messenger talking to the bearded man God, and a short humoristic sketch explaining the scene. God, the messenger says, your Jews are crying Gewalt, they need you, go down to them. God then comes down to his people, but is discontent with what he sees. Tfi, what kind of a synagogue is this? One that shows dresses and bared legs? They have lost their ways. Kibbutzer, the all-known commentator of the text, then interrupts him. No, dear Father, they have not lost their ways. The audience has already finished their prayers and are now in the third act of the botched play. So while this caricature merges the synagogue and the theater through space and spectatorship, it also draws a clear distinction between these two arenas. One governed by the strict ruling of divine providence, the other an arena in which bodily performances transgress the assumed boundaries between the sacred and the secular. The interlacing of the synagogue and the theater destabilizes the synagogue's paramount status as an idiosyncratic social and spiritual institution, undermines established cultural hierarchies, and is therefore also a signal of cultural and social change. From this perspective, the entanglement of the synagogue and the theater points towards a larger process of shifting sentiments from traditional Jewish expressive culture to modern popular entertainment. So much like the theater, during the turn of the 20th century, the synagogue afforded a communal cultural venue in which Jews could meet and be together, listen to Jewish sonority, and actively participate in the public performances. During times of mass migration from Eastern Europe, both the theater and the synagogue provided a place whereby individuals could imagine a shared tradition, a cohesive community, and a sense of cultural stability within a social reality fraught with defragmentation. And yet, despite these evident similarities, the synagogue and the theater offered two distinctly different performances and different ways of knowing. The religious ritual in the synagogue served as an expression of immutable piety and faith, while the Yiddish theater gave voice to the to the cultural processes, epistemic structures, and historical trajectories of its audiences. The synagogue offered an arena for its congregation to rehearse their tradition and heritage as part of their ongoing search for continuity and identity building, and alternatively, the Yiddish theater offered its audience new ways of connecting to their past, ways that acknowledge modern cultural shifts and Jewish transformations. So in my talk, I wish to focus on the synagogue and the theater as conveying two intertwined modes of cultural expressions and knowledge, and explore ways by which it converged. The convergence of the early popular Yiddish theater and synagogue, as I hope to demonstrate, fostered new Jewish forms of remembering. That is, affirming a shared understanding of a past alongside its collective meanings and interpretations. The Yiddish theater reenacted songs and liturgies from the synagogue, biblical heroes and heroines, mythical tales, and Jewish historical plots as part of its eclectic spectrum of cultural references through which it manifested the growing rupture between religiosity, tradition, and modernity. It recapitulated tradition and heritage with new aesthetic frames, ultimately creating a new discursive form of Jewish cultural memory. And so the gist of my argument is that the early Yiddish popular theater reshaped cultural memory by capitalizing on the prolific tension between tradition and modernism, a theme that resonated with the lived experience of its audiences in profound ways. This is also what made it into a primary stage for negotiating Jewish identity, history, and communal change. My argument builds upon Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's study of evolving forms of Jewish collective memory from traditional customs to modern historical interpretation. I view Yiddish theater as a form of memory, utilizing on Marvin Carlson's definition of theater as a cultural activity deeply involved with memory and haunted by repetition. Through performances, stories, and rituals, Yiddish theater reenacted and thus reshaped events and experiences, thereby preserving them in cultural consciousness. So following Carlson and Yerushalmi, I wish to explore how the convergence of the theater and the synagogue altered Jewish collective ways of knowing the past and how it transformed Jewish cultural memory. And to do so, I examine how it molded its themes, forms, and practices in relation to the Jewish past and how its actors perceived themselves as chronicles of Jewish culture. The central case study of my exploration is Die Chazante, an operetta in 3 acts by Boris Tomaszewski, with music composed by Joseph Rumshinsky that premiered in 1918 at Tomaszewski's Theater in New York. The operetta featured some of the most popular stars of the Yiddish musical stage. Among them were Kalman Juwelier, Regina Prager, Dora Weissman, William Schwartz, and even Tomaszewski himself. Die Chazante became one of Rumshinsky and Tomaszewski's commercial hits, with numerous successful runs in the decade following its debut. The plot of the operetta focuses on the Chazante, the cantor's widow, her family, and the complex relationships between her 4 sons and their family. The play opens at the home of the Chazante in a small shtetl in Galicia, where the family has gathered on the Chazan's yahrzeit. This occasion serves to commemorate the Chazan and perpetuate his legacy, establishing his hovering memory and enduring disembodied presence as a central theme at the outset of his operetta. At this family reunion, Yankev, one of the Chazante's son and the theater impresario, persuades his mother and brothers to immigrate to America and join him in New York, where he is planning to open another theater house. The other three sons of the Chazante are interested due to their relevant professions. Gdalia, a modern Chazan, Shloime, a conductor at the Paris Opera, and the youngest, Nochum, a Russian opera star. Through their professions, we can see a transition from the synagogue to the theater stage. Their father was a cantor, and they carry on his legacy through different entertainment stages. These four brothers are then joined by Regina, the daughter of Gdalia the Chazan. She has lived abroad for her education and thus never met her uncle. The operetta's drama commences as Regina and her uncle Nochum meet each other and ignite a fervent romance. Despite their intense love, Regina wrestles with unease over the notion of a romantic relationship with her uncle. We can talk about that later. The second act, this is a recurring theme in Yiddish theater, these kind of relationships. The second act takes place on a ship as the family crosses the Atlantic Ocean on their way to immigrate to New York. On board, Regina is swept by another love affair, this time with Dade, an Austrian, apparently non-Jewish opera singer, traveling to New York with his mother. Regina also has reservations regarding this love affair since Dade is not Jewish. These misgivings exacerbate as the objections vented by her family and by Dade's family enhance. While their love does not diminish, they decide to separate. Act 3 takes place in the family's new residence in New York in the days before the Passover, a holiday steeped in the act of collective remembrance by the retelling of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, the imperative to transmit it through generations, and its experiential understanding. Yes, b'chol dor vador, in every generation, a person must see themselves as if they left Egypt. On the backdrop of these traditional recollection performances, Regina meets her uncle Nochum, who restates his undying love for her. Regina, however, does not comply to his love due to their close family ties. The plots are so complicated that, During these moments of emotional climax, Nochum sings a theatrical version of Shema Yisrael. A 1919 Shelach sound recording performed by William Schwartz, who also played the role of Nochum in the operetta, provides us with a clue about the vocal execution of this musical number. In this song, Nochum's tenor voice passionately pleads to God to have his niece Regina fall in love with him. Let's hear a short excerpt from this.
Sure. Plug it in?
Definitely. Okay. the idea is understood. This is a very different Shmo Yisrael. So trained as a Meshorer in Yassi, Schwartz's performance of the Shema Yisrael affords a double meaning. It transposes the liturgical imploration from the religious fair onto the theater, carrying with it thematic and stylistic transgressions. Through the recording of this theatrical liturgical moment, the tension between the theater and the synagogue is translated into the severed body-voice relationship of sound recording media, reflecting the distancing of the singing body from its recorded voice. By doing so, the recording transforms a theatrical liturgical instant into a record, a sonic memory that represents a past performance. The presence-generating power of technologically mediated voice also appears in the third act of this operetta. In the third act of this operetta, when Dede, the Austrian opera singer, telephones the family on the days before the Passover, identifying as a lonesome visitor in town who has no place to celebrate the holiday. The telephone in this scene presents a modern mode of communication, streaming the day's disembodied voice as severed from his presence. This phone call prompts the family to adhere to the Jewish custom and invite the lonely Dede to their home on the holiday evening. Upon his arrival at the family residence, Dede publicly declares his love to Regina and reveals his true identity. He was born as a Jew. His mother long ago renounced her Judaism and adopted the guise of an Austrian Christian lady. This confession, however, does not bring Regina any closer to him, and instead it sparks her rejection. She contends that a person who does not cherish their people, tradition, and heritage could never truly love her, as these elements are woven into the fabric of her existence. Following this declaration, Regina rediscovers her love for Nochum, and they fall into each other's arm. Apparently, this operetta had various endings. As Neil Levine writes in the Milken archive website, there was another identity anagnorisis towards the denouncement of the play when Gedalia discloses that Regina is not his biological daughter, but an orphan he has adopted as a child, so that Nochum is not her uncle after all. All of this, which means that Regina no longer need to be put off by Nochum, to whom she was so favorably inclined in the first place. The operetta ends with the family giving their blessing to this reunion. The preeminence of family tradition in this operetta looms from its title, the Chazante, referring to the original meaning of the word, the cantor's wife. This title also resonates with the phenomenon of the Chazantes, female professional cantors that were popularized through their performances on concert stages, sound recordings, and later on the radio and even in movies. During the first decades of the 20th century, at the time of the debut of the operetta, the one arenas in which the Chazantes rarely overstepped traditional religious boundaries was that of serving as cantors in the synagogue. They filled a historical gap between the Zeugerin or the Zogerke women prayer leaders who led other women in separate prayer services in medieval and early modern Europe and the emergence of female cantors later in the 20th century. As evident from the operetta's plot, the role of the Chazante was not indispensable to advancing the drama of the operetta. So while the operetta's title evokes a feminine vocal performance of pious religiosity, its drama portrayed a modern Jewish plot of migration and identity transformations. Within this fictional trajectory of physical and cultural change, the Chazante in the title of the operetta addresses the female protagonist's vocal performance on stage. The role of the Chazante in this operetta was written and composed for Regina Prager, a prominent aging star of the Yiddish stage. Born in Lemberg in 1886 and trained as an opera singer, Prager was among the most prominent female icons of the Yiddish stage, famous on account of her lyrical voice. She immigrated to New York in 1885, where she played and sang in some of the most memorable moments of the Yiddish popular stage, in schlagers such as the New York production of Goldfaden's Shulamis and Bar Kochva, and in Moshe Horowitz's historical operetta Yetzias Mitzrayim. During the time of this performance, she was nearly 53 years old. Casting Prager for the role of the Chazante marked a moment of transition in her career. The instance she transformed from a diva leading lady role to the singing mother roles. Among the famous songs Prager performed in the Chazante was the Kaddish, a lamentation recited in this play as part of the Chazan's Yortzeit. A 1923 commercial sound recording of this song provides us with an oral souvenir of Prager's voice, demonstrating how Yiddish theater artists relied on liturgical frameworks as the basis for the modern creative practice. Prager's operatic voice performs the Kaddish as a responsive public prayer, mostly delivered by men through the period of mourning. And so she performs this masculine liturgy and transposes the ritual from the synagogue and the theater while also transgressing its gendered boundaries. Let's listen to an excerpt. Until the Amen. Prager's vocal performance of the matriarchal figure of the Chazantel left a strong impression on the audiences. As Mendel Osherovich writes, people saw something new, a leading lady in an older role, a leading lady as a mother, a leading lady as a grandmother, but one who could sing beautifully and act sincerely and naturally. And from then on, the Yiddish operetta stage was enriched with a whole array of types of singing women, of singing grandmothers, and all of these types were created especially for Madame Prager, and she graced them with her authentically Yiddish singing. Prager, to paraphrase Osherovich's word, was a carrier of tradition. Her voice conveyed melodies and rhythms that were perceived to be performed in an authentic way. At the core of the dynamic realm of Jewish migration depicted in the fictional world of the operetta, Prager was a surrogate vessel for Jewish heritage. As Joseph Rumshinsky recalls, she herself embodied Jewish tradition. She abided Jewish law and refused to perform on Friday evenings and on Jewish holidays, and she was a frequent synagogue goer. Piety was a central component of the roster of virtues assigned to her, conveyed through her performance. And yet, Prager did not fully conform to this traditional gender role. Her vocal performances on stage unveiled additional dimensions of her public performance. As as Joseph Rumshinsky depicts, the visceral impact of her voice on her admirers. The moment she began to sing with the very first note, she captivated everyone. And then he adds, streams of tender melody flowed from her and surged over the stage and over the theater. The audience was lured to her song, and it was as though they rose from the earth. A forgetfulness subdued everyone. And at the moment she finished singing, everyone awoke and applauded her. According to this impression, Prager enthralled the audience with her voice. She awakened the audience through her soft singing. According to Zilbertzweig's account, as soon as she uttered the initial notes of her tenor, she cast a spell over the audience. She caused them to disregard Samson's courage, akin to the men in the theater consumed by their fervor, awaiting the ignition of a flame. Prager's voice thus exemplified the rationale behind Kol Beisha Irva, meaning a woman's voice amounts to sexual excitement, banning men from listening to women's singing voice. And thus, in the synagogue, Prager practiced Jewish tradition by taking part in its religious rituals and conventions. However, in the theater, she could disobey these decrees and give voice to her dynamic and constantly shifting protein position along the spectrum between these distinct worlds. Prager embodied and thus reproduced the split between a pious religious woman and the new social conventions of the of modern Jewish culture. Osherovich, Rumshinsky, and Zilbertzweig rendered their own and others' experiences of listening to Prager in the theater into a performance site that took on meaning. In her performance, she embodied the entanglement of the synagogue and the theater, presenting new performance forms for delivering Jewish tradition as fraught with an internal rift. She mobilized into the stage Jewish religiosity while infusing it with the duplicity of modern Jewish consciousness. So the tension between tradition and modernity manifested in Prager's vocal performance as well as in her double identity is emblematic for understanding the ways in which Yiddish theater transformed cultural memory. And to explore how Yiddish theater facilitated the evolution from traditional memory to modern modes of remembering, I draw on Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's book, Zachor, Jewish History and Jewish Memory, in which he articulates the changing forms of Jewish memory. In his book, Yerushalmi claimed that pre-modern Jewish conceptions of memory relied on a religious belief in the divine providence. Modern Jewish culture abandoned this sacred belief and instead developed Jewish history as a new form of shared social memory that departed from traditional forms of memory like liturgy and ritual. Yerushalmi did not explicitly address the theater, but the 4 chapters of his influential work discuss Jewish expressive practices as vessels and vehicles of Jewish memory, and their transformation across different media and genres. In the first chapter, Yerushalmi describes Jewish manifestations of memory as generating from the biblical speech act, Zachor, remember. Through this performative decree, the Israelites experienced their present times as performances of memory. The Bible and the rabbinical literature that followed provide the dramaturgical model for Jewish memory as a foundational repository of events that would later be dramatized and reenacted. Among these are cyclic performances of destruction and redemption, Churban veGeulah. The second chapter of Yerushalmi's book delves into reenactment of this cycle, highlighting the role of ritualized prayers, such as kines and sliches, among other practices of atonement and fasting that focus on preserving and transmitting Jewish memory throughout the Middle Ages. It also briefly examines the Purim celebration as a transgressional communal event that challenges authority and institution. The third chapter focuses on the expulsion from Spain, and particularly on the Marranos, crypto-Jews forced to convert to Christianity by the Spanish Inquisition. As David Myers explains, the Marranos are discussed in this book as forerunners of modern Jewish identity that oscillates between 2 worlds. And the final chapter of this book addresses the modern era, in which Yerushalmi regards as the quintessential age of historicism. In this period, Jewish historians and historiographical practices reflect the complex inner conflicts of modern identity, navigating between tradition and the demands of contemporary historical thinking that animates a rupture in forms and practices of Jewish memory. The Yiddish popular theater illustrates Yerushalmi's argument. From its outset, modern Jewish theater was keen on staging mythical and actual events from Jewish history, as well as recording the present. Biblical stories from age-old Jewish past, such as the destruction of Jerusalem, mythical events such as the Exodus from Egypt, or foundational figures such as King Solomon or King Chizkiyahu, were often the thematic focus of historical operas and operettas. These were supplemented by depictions of current events, such as Churban Kishinev, that transpires on the backdrop of the 1903 pogrom, the war in Cuba, reflecting upon more recent history of its creators and audience. And furthermore, the Yiddish theater often staged Lebensbilders, plays that represented the challenges and hardship of Jewish migrants in New York. These aspects are, of course, also apparent in Die Chazante, with its 3 acts taking place in changing locations portraying the family's migration route. The theater thus became a form of recording history of its creators and audience, among which were migration, cross-cultural, cross-generational conflicts, transformations of family structures, and timely anxieties concerning identity loss. Through historical plots, it staged the growing tension between modernity and Jewish tradition, reflecting upon the transformation of Jewish religious life. The Yiddish popular theater was especially attracted to staging figures that have distanced themselves from Jewish tradition, heroines that willingly or otherwise converted to Christianity, and other forms of assimilated Jews. These themes are especially apparent in the many Yiddish theater plays featuring Spanish inquisitors, monks, and conversos, a leitmotif which were also at the core of Yerushalmi's thinking. So these are some of the examples. So Inquisition dramas, as Joel Berkovich explains, offered depictions remote in time and place of a historical parallel to ordeals which a large part of the audiences had experienced firsthand. And at the same time, the leitmotif of the Spanish Inquisition on the Yiddish stage may also be interpreted as a meta-theatrical gesture on the rise of the Yiddish theater as a novel form of recording and narrating Jewish history. It presents the cultural trope of the Marranos themselves playing roles on the public stage as a primary model of Jewish theatricality and a reflexive trope for the staging of Jewish history. By virtue of its inner doubling, the Yiddish theater focused on converted Jews in order to reflect upon the modern Jewish dynamics of assimilation and acculturation and the remaking of the Jewish self by way of linguistic and gestural transformations. These notions are also rehearsed in Die Chazante. Identity transformation, disguise, and the distancing from tradition are intertwined with the figure of the assimilated Austrian opera singer Dade and his mother, as well as the 4 sons of the Chazante that present various aspects of Jewish theatricality. And then, of course, among them stands out Yankev, this theater impresario who persuades his family to migrate and thus change their identities. As forms of history telling, the modern Yiddish theater conveyed fundamental perceptual divides associated with modern cultural transformation through historical plots that underscore the change of Jewish tradition, through the figures of the Meshumadim or the Marranos, through narratives of migration, by modifying traditional Jewish songs and by documenting them in commercial sound recordings that manifest the rift between the human voice and its technological reproduction, or of course in sheet music that enabled the audience to reenact melodies of its performances. The archival manuscript of Die Chazante illuminates another practice through which the Yiddish theater recorded history. Throughout the years, the Chazante was produced many times, with various elements altered according to the beat of the hour, such as additions or omissions of lines and musical numbers. Its play text is a palimpsest that discloses numerous layers of the operetta's performance history. Its omissions and abbreviations point at the theatrical dynamics and perhaps also at the prioritization of songs and dances over long-spoken replicas. And furthermore, the marginalia and scribblings on the sides of its manuscript pages hint towards the state of mind of its creator. In the archival manuscript I have obtained, a typescript that was used for a production in 1932-1933 season of the script of the operetta presents us with one of the many drafts of the operetta. On one of the pages, at the end of the first act, the following sentence has been added in pencil for Gedalia the Chazan. May God protect us from Hitler and bring us in the peace of to the land of Israel, it states. This handwritten marking intervenes in the flow of the drama, supplementing its plot with contemporaneous interjections that ruptures the fictional realm performed on stage. This intervention may also be understood as a form of history writing, indicating the concerns of the actors and perhaps also of its audience. Writing history, according to Yerushalmi, is in and of itself a modern performance that wedges an internal divide within the historian. This argument, of course, echoes Ronald Barth's statement in Camera Lucida that history is hysterical. It is constituted only if we consider it, only if we look at it, and in order to look at it, we must be excluded from it. For Yerushalmi, this argument presents a self-reflexive gesture in which he points at an open wound. As a historian, he is a product of a profound breach between two forms of memory, Jewish tradition and modern history. The experience of two beings within one person, the one clandestine and the other public, ties together the theater actor and the historian. This idea of the actor qua historian transgressed the Yiddish stage. Many of the actors, composers, and directors who fashioned the Yiddish theater considered themselves as lay historians and were obsessed with narrating the history of the Yiddish theater along the dozens of written histories featuring countless zichroines, biographical and autobiographical account penned by actors and actresses. They all partook in the turn of the century media generation that lived in between worlds and were thus constituted by novel modes of interactions with memory. These theater makers brought to the Yiddish stage modern modes of writing, listening, and recordings that enabled them to negotiate their identities through their encounters with new technologies and forms. Accordingly, they sought to capture the voices and sounds played in the Yiddish theater. They were actors in the formation of a larger revolution that practiced Jewish historical knowledge. As historians, actors and creators of Yiddish theater obtained a position betwixt and between fact and fiction. They were caught within the paradox of the relation between the real and the discursive. On the theater stage, they transformed reality into abstract images, playing around with them through embodied performance forms. Within their memoirs and chronicles recordings, they portrayed history as a creative endeavor infused with social storytelling. To conclude, the emerging enterprise of the Yiddish theater was rooted in the rich tapestry of Jewish tradition that served as a nexus for exploring, recording, and reshaping Jewish cultural memory in the face of profound social and technological change. And accordingly, its actors and singers performed modern ways of recording the past. They enacted the inner divide between tradition and modernity as a core perceptual and thematic conflict of their stage identities and public persona. Borrowing themes and forms from the synagogue ritual, they narrated the stories of their split communities and their distancing from tradition as part of the modern Jewish experience of being torn between identities and worlds. By doing so, they established the Yiddish theater stage as an arena for Jewish history in the making. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions, comments.
Shkoyach, Ruthie, thanks. That was fascinating. And I love the theatricality of the presentation. Your points about the history, Jewish history on stage and sort of backstage with all of this, these memoirs and Zilbertzweig, et cetera, is really interesting. And just to elaborate on that a little bit, of course, like you find that in a certain amount of that in any theatrical culture. Actors write memoirs all the time, right? Directors, et cetera. What I've always thought of as like incredible self-consciousness of this theatrical culture is so striking to me. And like they're starting to write memoirs of like the genesis of the modern Yiddish stage from at most like 10 years, 25 years after. They're starting to like see these occasions to like, we're going to chronicle the whole history of the modern Yiddish stage, which they were,
they know
just a
that
few
it
years
has
ago.
history before it has a history.
And I wonder if you have some thoughts on like what, I have maybe my own theories, but I'm interested to hear you sort of reflect on like what is behind that remarkable, just sort of, I'd say sort of fixation on like telling the story as it's really only beginning to unfold.
I think, first of all, this is a new practice for Jewish actors, of course. I mean, if Jewish theater really begins in 1876, then this is a new practice. And as you say, it's fascinating to see that it happens basically when a few years after Yiddish theater begins. And I think the one way to look at it is to look at sort of the broader field and to see their engagement with also with the new sound recording media, with other modern forms of recordings. And so when they record their voices and when Zilbertzweig or Adler or whoever records their memoirs, I think these are sort of, we need to look at them as sort of one field of trying to understand that. And I think that's one of the profound, maybe epistemic changes that happened during that time. And I think that the tie between what's going on stage that is so obsessed with history and with Jewish history, which it doesn't have to be. I mean, I think this is an aesthetic choice, of course, and what is happening off stage and how these people perceive themselves as people who are really making cultural change it crosses genres and it crosses media. But I'd love also to hear your thoughts on it.
Right, just to this point, I think you need to distinguish between a guy like Zilbertzweig, who was writing a history, a lexicon, an encyclopedia, who was being very detached and objective, and these self-fashioned writers, the actors themselves. Because this is a popular theater tradition, it's different than, say, if it's Helen Hayes writing her memoir. They have to create their own persona and their own legacy because of an audience that needs to have it explained to them because they are figures of such importance. They have a responsibility. So although they do some history, it's mostly about establishing their own image, as people who are constantly being watched and constantly being speculated about, within a community. It's a very different sense in a way than, history, by professional historians that they're engaged with, I would say.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think I don't really agree with Zilbertzweig as being sort of objective. First of all, because he... A lexicon, well, he calls it a lexicon, but it establishes itself as a lexicon, sort of as an authoritative lexicon, much later than when he begins, and he begins as a sort of oral history project. So, and in a way, I think these hierarchies are also very apparent when you read the lexicon. And also the self-fashioning of the field is very apparent. And also the lexicon draws on these zichroines. So, so you're starting so you find yourself in a tautological loop. And I think that's how this paper began for me because, I've been reading all these memoirs and they're so subjective.
And there's a third. There's someone in between all of them was Sholem Perlmutter, whom it was one of the you had the illustration of him up there. His book, Jiddische Dramaturgen und Theaterkompositoren, it's filled with these quasi-historical anecdotes that are mostly phantasmagoric. I mean, he just kind of makes these anecdotes up. But he claimed that Tomaszewski told him that he wrote Die Gazente because there was a German playwright, Rössler, who his career reached its heights in the Nazi era. But in the early 20th century, he wrote a play called Die Vier Frankfurter. It was about the Rothschilds. It was about banking. It was about Jews and banking. And Tomaszewski wanted to respond and say, no, it's Jews and music.
Nice.
And so he created, instead of the Rothschild International Network, it was the Jewish Music International Network of these brothers who were the sons of the Kanzler.
I think it's super interesting, but I'll just say that, these narrative frames, you find them really recurring from the beginning of the Yiddish theater, of the mother, Mirale Efos is like, but that's a bit later, but that's the sort of the dramaturgical frame of, the family with the four stands, and you find this really as a recurring theme. But it's interesting that he's sort of putting it into one source of the Vier Frankfurters.
Incidentally, Rumshinsky's manuscript too is here at UCLA. It's worth looking at. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Ruthie. Fascinating as always. I love that cartoon you put up. I love cartoons. That cartoon you put up about God in the theater. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about what you perceive to be the main differences between those two contexts. You pointed out the presence of women, and in particular women immodestly dressed, as one of the key points of difference. And I'm wondering if you could just discuss a little bit what this cartoon presents as the most significant differences.
I think the caricature plays on the similarities and differences. So, at first glance, it might be sort of the same place, but only to the right we have, the God figure, and to the left we have the praying man near the Bine. But I think that when you look at it closer, of course, then the Yiddish theater from its beginning included women in its performances, with Sarah Siegel acting in very soon after Goldfaden begins. And it becomes a stage that is sort of very, gender-wise, is very different than the synagogue. And I think that, Regina Prager's performance also demonstrates that a bit. And I think the kibbutzer, he sort of, I don't know why so subtly when women really took a bigger stage, but I think maybe because of sexuality, when you see the women hiding between these two curtains, I don't know, for me, I thought that this is sort of an illustration of the in-between position that they obtained during that time. Thank you.
So thank you, Ruthie. This is really incredible. I mean, I think you've outlined something for us to really chew on, to figure out how the musical pieces of a lot of these things really come into play. And, one thought is, in the Kaddish, at least this is the first time I've heard it, it goes in and out of High Holy Day motifs. And it's really interesting to see how the Yiddish, what role the Yiddish plays, in the sort of, interpolated phrases, that are interstitial phrases, that it has. So I think that that's something to of course, further develop. The other thing that is occurring to me that I keep thinking about is that you're sort of presenting this as if, Yiddish theater is this area of great, robust growth, and that's not happening in the synagogue. Or it's certainly happening differently in Yiddish theater than it is happening in the synagogue. And what's very interesting is that up until the 1920s, most of the development of synagogue music that's new, is happening outside of New York. It's happening in the South. It's happening actually in San Francisco. things kind of re-galvanize into New York. Judah Cohen wrote this wonderful book where he talks about synagogue music in the 19th century, and which kind of decenters New York as the arena, but we're still at a time period where the great canon of the Golden Age is really at its height, during this period of time. And there are a lot of changes musically, within that. So I think there's a lot to dialogue on, between the two. So.
Definitely. I'm no expert in, synagogue music, and of course not in synagogal music history. And I think it's super interesting to see what's happening during these times in the synagogue. And I think it's also interesting to see, this booming New York theater scene, Yiddish theater scene, and then at the same time, as you say, or Judah Cohen says, when you look at synagogue music, it really decenters from New York. And, I wonder how to think of these two sort of processes as working together.
New York is recentering, I think, shortly after this period. Then there's a whole other period of time, whereas Yiddish theater declines, all the, Elstein and Rushinsky are redeveloping synagogue music, in other ways. So a lot more to talk about.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
You mentioned the New York theater scene, New York Yiddish theater scene. You were talking about decentralizing synagogue music, and you were talking about an international artistic agenda, at least with this one person. What about Yiddish theater in places other than New York? And I don't mean like Philadelphia, I mean Russia or Poland. So just in general, more broadly speaking.
That is a very long, that is a very long debate. Basically, in 1883, there's a ban on Jewish theater in the Russian Empire, which causes a mass migration to New York, making it as a center. The repertoire produced of the popular Yiddish theater produced in New York is then brought back to America, and there it becomes a sort of American repertoire, and it is performed by theater makers that are still in Europe, and mainly by traveling troops like Sam Adler's and Campagnettes, and also in centers such as Warsaw and later Vienna, of course, London, Paris. I mean, it's all over the place. But this repertoire is also migrates back to, or maybe transmigrates back to Europe. And the relationships, of course, between the transatlantic, that's super interesting. And it also happens with the sound recordings. So the voices, so these actors are, they come from Europe, mostly from Lemberg, from the theater that, the Jewish theater that was very successful there, but they're imported to New York, and then they record themselves, and many of the sound recordings do their ways back to Europe.
All right. Please join me once again in thanking Ruthie.
Thank you so much.